life's strange and wondrous creatures fluttered and scurried in the underbrush, and the air was thick with the scent of blooming flora, their colors vibrant and alien to any human eye. Among the grandeur of nature's canvas, a modest dwelling stood on the edge of a crystalline lake, its walls shimmering with the bioluminescent hues of the native mosses that clung to its surface. Inside this dwelling, a family gathered around a circular table, their faces illuminated by the gentle, flickering light of a floating orb that hovered above them. Xenia, the eldest daughter of the household, sat between her father and her younger sister, Ryla. Her silver eyes, a common trait among the Erendorians, gleamed with the light of the orb, reflecting a deep content that came from the simple joy of being with her loved ones. Xenia was young by Erendorian standards, just over a century old, though she appeared to be in her early 20s by human reckoning. Her skin was a soft, iridescent blue, and her hair, which flowed like a silken waterfall down her back, was a deep shade of violet that matched the twilight sky. She was considered beautiful by her people, but it was her sharp mind and compassionate heart that truly defined her. Ryla, you mustn't forget the blossom dance tomorrow, Xenia reminded her sister with a gentle smile as she passed a plate of glistening fruit across the table. The elders will be watching, and you've practiced so hard. Ryla, barely half Xenia's age and still with the wide-eyed wonder of youth, grinned sheepishly. I won't forget, Xenia, I promise. Their father, a wise elder named Kalon, chuckled softly. Xenia, your sister has your spirit. She'll do well, just as you did when it was your turn. Xenia's heart swelled with pride as she gazed at her family, the love between them as tangible as the warmth of the sun. This was her world, a place of peace, tradition, and deep connections. She had always known her path to honor her family, to contribute to her community, and to one day guide others as her father did. Life on Erendor, with all its customs and responsibilities, was all she had ever known, and all she had ever wanted. But the calm before the storm is often the most deceiving. The next morning dawned bright and clear, the air filled with the sweet fragrance of the Wylantha blossoms that bloomed only during this season. Xenia had risen early to prepare for the festival, a day of celebration that marked the renewal of life on Erendor. The Blossom Dance was an age-old tradition, where the youth of the planet performed intricate dances to honor the cycle of life and death, of endings and new beginnings. Ryla was excited beyond words, her energy infectious as she twirled around in her ceremonial robes, the fabric woven with the threads of her people's rich history. Xenia watched her with a smile, her own heart light with the anticipation of the day's festivities. But as the time for the dance approached, an unease began to settle over her, like a dark cloud drifting into the clear sky of her mind. It began subtly, with the arrival of a messenger from the Council of Elders. The messenger was a stern figure, cloaked in the deep crimson of his station, his expression unreadable as he bowed to Xenia's father. Kalon, elder of the 7th house, the council summons you and your daughter Xenia, the messenger intoned, his voice devoid of emotion. Xenia's heart skipped a beat, confusion mingling with the growing dread that had begun to gnaw at the edges of her thoughts. Her father's face, usually so calm and assured, tightened with concern. Xenia Kalon's voice was gentle, but there was an edge of urgency that Xenia had never heard before. Go with the messenger. I will join you shortly. The world around her seemed to blur as Xenia followed the messenger, her feet moving automatically, while her mind raced with questions. What could the council want with her? She had done nothing wrong, nothing to warrant such a summons. The Council of Elders was the highest authority on Erendor, and a summons from them was rare, often signaling matters of great importance or grave consequence. The council hall was an imposing structure, carved from the very rock of the mountains that bordered the city. Its grand pillars, adorned with ancient symbols of power and wisdom, seemed to loom over Xenia as she entered, her heart pounding in her chest. The hall was filled with the elders, their faces grave as they turned their eyes upon her. At the center of the room stood Elder Varys, a man whose presence commanded respect and fear in equal measure. His eyes, cold and calculating, fixed on Xenia as she approached, her knees threatening to buckle under the weight of their scrutiny. Xenia of the 7th house, Elder Varys began, his voice echoing through the hall like a pronouncement of doom. You stand before us today accused of a grave crime. A crime that, if proven true, will demand the most severe of punishments. Xenia's breath caught in her throat. Crime? What crime? I don't understand. Elder Varys' gaze hardened. You are accused of betraying the sacred trust of your people, of revealing our most guarded secrets to the humans, the very beings we have kept at arm's length to preserve the sanctity of our world. The accusation hit Xania like a physical blow, the air leaving her lungs in a rush. Betrayal? Secrets? Her mind reeled as she tried to comprehend the enormity of the charge. She had never even interacted with humans, save for the stories she had heard, the warnings of their greed and destructiveness. How could she be accused of such a thing? This is a mistake, Xania pleaded, her voice trembling. I have done nothing of the sort. I would never betray my people. But her protests fell on deaf ears. The elders began to murmur among themselves, their voices a low rumble of judgment and doubt. Elder Varys raised a hand, silencing them as he stared down at Xania, his expression unmoved by her pleas. The evidence against you is strong, he said coldly. Your communications have been intercepted, messages sent beyond our borders, containing information that could only have come from within our most secure archives. Your own access codes were used. Xenia's mind raced. Could it be? Was it possible that someone had used her codes, framed her for this heinous crime? But who would do such a thing and why? My codes, I have never shared them with anyone, Xenia insisted, desperation creeping into her voice. This must be a mistake. Someone is framing me. Elder Varys' eyes narrowed. A convenient excuse, but one that does not hold against the evidence. Your defense is weak, Xenia. We have no choice but to act according to our laws. Xenia's father, Kalon, finally entered the hall, his face ashen as he took in the scene. He moved to stand beside his daughter, his hand resting gently on her shoulder, but the strength of his presence was not enough to dispel the cloud of doom that hung over her. Elder Varys Kalon began, his voice steady but filled with a quiet plea. Surely there is more to be considered here. My daughter is innocent. She would never commit such a crime. But Elder Varys was unmoved. Kalon, your position does not exempt you or your family from the law. The council has deliberated, and the evidence is clear. Xenia must face the consequences of her actions. Xenia felt the ground slipping away from under her, the weight of the accusation crushing her spirit. Her father's words of protest, the looks of pity from the other elders, all blurred together as the reality of her situation sank in. Xenia of the Seventh House, Elder Varys intoned, his voice resonating with finality. For the crime of betraying your people, you are hereby sentenced to exile. You will be handed over to the humans as a slave, to live out your days in servitude. May the gods have mercy on your soul. The words struck Xenia like a death knell, and for a moment the world around her went silent, as if the very fabric of reality had been torn asunder. Exile, slave. The words echoed in her mind, each repetition hammering away at her will to fight, to survive. No, this can't be, Xenia whispered, her voice barely audible. But the elders had already turned away, their judgment passed, their decision final. Her father tried to comfort her, his own despair barely contained. Xenia, I will find a way to prove your innocence. I will not rest until you are free. But Xenia barely heard him. The world she had known, the life she had cherished, was gone in an instant. She was to be sent to the humans, to a fate worse than death. The thought of it, of being stripped of her freedom, her dignity, was unbearable. As she was led away, the last thing she saw was the pain in her father's eyes, and the last thing she felt was the cold, merciless grip of despair tightening around her heart. The journey to Earth was a blur of terror and disbelief. Xenia had been placed in a stasis chamber, a standard procedure for long interplanetary travel, but even in her suspended state, her mind raced with fragments of thoughts, memories of her family, and the cold dread of what awaited her. The first breath Xenia took on Earth was heavy and unfamiliar. The air, thick with humidity and the scent of unfamiliar flora, clung to her lungs like a foreign substance. The sky above was a muted blue, dotted with clouds that lacked the ethereal quality of the twin moons she was used to on Arendor. Everything about this planet felt alien to her, from the rough texture of the soil beneath her feet to the strange hum of human technology that buzzed in the background. Xenia stood on the landing pad, her heart pounding in her chest as she took in her surroundings. The ship that had brought her here, a sleek, cold vessel that bore the insignia of the Arendorian Council, loomed behind her like a specter of her past. In front of her, a man waited her new master. The thought sent a shiver down her spine. a mix of fear and revulsion curling in her stomach. Luke was not what she had expected. He was tall and broad-shouldered, his skin bronzed by the sun, with dark hair that curled slightly at the ends. His face was angular, marked by a few small scars that spoke of a life that had seen its share of hardship. But it was his eyes that caught her attention green, like the forests of Arendor, but filled with a depth and warmth that she had not anticipated. "Xania," he asked, his voice deep but surprisingly gentle. "I'm Luke." She didn't respond, her gaze fixed somewhere beyond him, her mind racing with the weight of her new reality. She was here on Earth, far from everything and everyone she had ever known, and this man was now her master. The word echoed in her mind, carrying with it a sense of degradation that was almost unbearable. Luke seemed to sense her turmoil, his expression softening as he took a cautious step closer. "I can't imagine what you're feeling right now, but I want you to know that I'm not going to hurt you. You're safe here." Safe. The word felt hollow to her. How could she be safe when she had been ripped from her home, accused of a crime she hadn't committed, and sold into slavery? But she had no choice but to follow him, her legs moving automatically as he gestured toward a small vehicle waiting nearby. The ride to Luke's home was silent, the tension in the air thick enough to cut. Xenia kept her eyes on the landscape that passed by, noting the strange, blocky buildings, the odd assortment of human vehicles, and the people who seemed to move with a hurried purpose that was foreign to her. Earth was a far cry from Arendor's harmonious blend of nature and technology. Everything here seemed harsh and unrefined, and it only deepened the sense of isolation that weighed on her. After what felt like an eternity, they arrived at Luke's home. It was a modest dwelling set apart from the bustle of the nearby city. The house was small and simple, constructed from wood and stone, with a garden out front that was wild with native earth plants. It was a far cry from the sleek, organic architecture of Arendor, but it had a certain charm, a warmth that was unexpected. "Here we are," Luke said, stepping out of the vehicle and moving to open the door for her. "This is your new home." Home. The word was a cruel joke. Xenia stepped out of the vehicle, her feet heavy as she followed him inside. The interior of the house was just as simple as the exterior, with wooden floors, plain furniture, and windows that let in the fading light of the day. It was quiet, almost eerily so, and the unfamiliarity of it all made her feel like an intruder in a world that was not her own. Luke led her to a small room at the back of the house. "This is your room," he said, pushing the door open. "I know it's not much, but you can make it your own. I'll give you privacy to settle in." The room was sparse, with only a bed, a small dresser, and a single window that looked out onto the garden. The bed was covered with a simple quilt, and the dresser was bare, waiting for belongings that Xenia did not have. It was a far cry from her room on Arendor, with its soft, glowing walls and the intricate tapestries that told the stories of her people. Here, there was nothing to remind her of home, nothing to anchor her to the life she had lost. When Luke left her alone, Xenia finally allowed herself to sink onto the bed, her composure cracking as the reality of her situation crashed down on her. She was alone, truly alone, in a world that was completely alien to her. She had no one to turn to, no one who understood her pain or her fear. Tears welled in her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. She would not break, not yet. But as the hours passed, the emptiness of the room and the overwhelming sense of loss became too much to bear. Her thoughts were a whirlwind of memories and fears her father's pained expression as she was taken away, the cold eyes of Elder Varys as he sentenced her, the laughter of her sister Ryla that she would never hear again. It was all gone, ripped away from her, and she was left with nothing but the cold comfort of a bed in a strange room on a strange planet. She didn't know how long she sat there, lost in her thoughts, but eventually the door opened, and Luke stepped inside, carrying a tray of food. The smell of it filled the room, warm and inviting, but Xenia's stomach twisted at the thought of eating. She had no appetite, her body numb with grief. "I brought you something to eat," Luke said softly, setting the tray down on the small table by the window. "I know it's all unfamiliar, but you need to keep your strength up." Xenia didn't respond, her eyes fixed on the tray, but not really seeing it. Luke sighed, running a hand through his hair as he crouched down beside her, trying to meet her gaze. "Xenia, I know this is hard. I can't imagine what you're going through, but I want to help. I don't want you to feel like a prisoner here." The words were kind, but they only served to remind her of the chains she now wore, invisible but heavy all the same. "I am a prisoner," she whispered, her voice hoarse from disuse. "I was taken from my home and brought here against my will. How can I be anything but a prisoner?" Luke flinched, the pain in her voice cutting through him like a knife. "I know," he said quietly, "but I promise you, I won't treat you like one. I don't believe in this system. I'll do whatever I can to make you feel human again." The irony of his words wasn't lost on Xenia. She wasn't human. She was Arendorian, a fact that seemed to matter little to those who had condemned her. But she saw something in Luke's eyes of sincerity, a genuine desire to help, and it was enough to soften the edges of her anger, if only slightly. "Why did you take me?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Why would you want a slave if you don't believe in it?" Luke hesitated, clearly struggling to find the right words. "I didn't have a choice," he admitted. "The system, there are rules, expectations. I'm in a position where refusing would have had consequences for me and for others. But that doesn't mean I agree with it." Xenia studied him, trying to gauge the truth of his words. There was something about him, something that made her want to believe him. But trust was a luxury she could no longer afford, not after everything that had happened. "I won't pretend to understand what you've been through," Luke continued. "But I want to give you some control back, as much as I can. You're free to move around the house, to do as you please. You're not confined to this room. And if there's anything you need, anything at all, just tell me." It was a small gesture, but in the midst of her despair, it felt like a lifeline. Xenia nodded slowly, still wary but grateful for the offer. "Thank you," she murmured, her voice barely audible. Luke offered her a small, sad smile. "It's the least I can do. I'll leave you to rest. If you need anything, I'll be in the other room." With that, he stood and left the room, closing the door softly behind him. Xenia stared at the tray of food for a long moment before finally reaching for it, her hands trembling as she lifted the spoon to her mouth. The food was strange, the flavors unfamiliar, but it was warm, and it filled the emptiness in her stomach, if not in her heart. As she ate, Xenia allowed herself to think about Luke. He was different from what she had expected. He was kind, gentle even, and there was a sadness in him that mirrored her own. Perhaps it was possible, she thought, to survive this. Perhaps she could find a way to endure, to make a life for herself here, as impossible as it seemed. But even as she entertained the thought, a deep, gnawing fear lingered in the back of her mind. This world was not her own, and no matter how kind Luke might be, she was still a prisoner here, bound by the laws of a society she didn't understand. The walls of the room seemed to close in on her, and the weight of her situation pressed down on her with an almost suffocating intensity. That night, as she lay in the unfamiliar bed, Xenia stared up at the ceiling, her thoughts a tangled mess of fear, anger, and uncertainty. She had always been strong, always faced challenges head-on, but this was beyond anything she had ever imagined. Sleep didn't come easily. Her mind refused to quiet, replaying the events of the past days over and over, the injustice of it all gnawing at her sanity. When she finally drifted off, her dreams were filled with images of Arendor, of her family, and of the cold, unforgiving faces of the council as they sentenced her to this fate. Morning came too soon, the light streaming through the window pulling her from the restless sleep. For a moment she forgot where she was, the unfamiliarity of the room jarring her back to reality. The pain of her new reality was sharp, like a wound that refused to heal. She dressed slowly, her movements sluggish as the weight of her situation settled over her once more. When she finally left the room, she found Luke in the kitchen, preparing breakfast. He looked up as she entered, a small smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "Good morning," he said, his tone gentle. "Did you sleep well?" Xenia hesitated before responding. "As well as I could." Luke nodded, his expression understanding. "I made breakfast. It's nothing fancy, but you're welcome to join me." She approached the table, eyeing the food warily. It was simple fare, much like the dinner he had brought her the night before, but the thoughtfulness behind the gesture wasn't lost on her. She sat down, her movements stiff as she picked up a piece of toast, and began to eat. Luke watched her for a moment before speaking. "I was thinking maybe today we could go for a walk. I can show you around the area if you're up for it." The idea of leaving the confines of the house both intrigued and terrified her. The thought of stepping outside, of seeing more of this alien world, was daunting, but she knew she couldn't stay hidden away forever. If she was to survive here, she would need to adapt. All right, she agreed, her voice steady despite the turmoil inside her. Luke's smile widened, a genuine warmth in his eyes. Great. Finish your breakfast and we can head out whenever you're ready. The rest of the meal passed in relative silence, but the tension between them had lessened, if only slightly. Xenia found herself studying Luke, trying to understand him, to figure out what kind of man he truly was. He had shown her kindness, a stark contrast to the cruelty she had expected, but she couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to him than met the eye. After breakfast, they set out on their walk. The air outside was fresh, tinged with the scent of earth and greenery. The path Luke led her on wound through the woods behind his house, the trees towering above them like silent sentinels. It was quiet, the only sounds the rustle of leaves and the occasional chirping of birds. As they walked, Luke pointed out different plants and landmarks, his voice calm and soothing. Xenia listened, trying to absorb the information, though her mind was still preoccupied with thoughts of home. The landscape was beautiful in its own way, but it was a far cry from the lush, vibrant world she had known. They came to a small clearing, where a stream bubbled gently over smooth stones, the water crystal clear. Luke stopped, turning to face her, his expression thoughtful. I know this isn't easy for you, he said softly, but I hope that, in time, you'll find some peace here. I'm not asking you to forget your past or where you came from, but maybe, just maybe, you can find a way to live here, to find something that makes it a little less painful. Xenia looked at him, searching his eyes for any sign of deceit, but all she found was sincerity. He truly wanted to help her, to make her feel at home, even if it was an impossible task. For the first time since her arrival, she felt a glimmer of hope, fragile and fleeting, but they're all the same. Thank you, she said quietly. For everything. Luke smiled, a small, sad smile that spoke of his own struggles. You don't need to thank me. Just know that you're not alone in this. They stood there for a moment, the sound of the stream filling the silence between them. Xenia felt a strange sense of calm, the first she had experienced since leaving Arendor. It wasn't much, but it was a start, and for now, that was enough. As they made their way back to the house, Xenia couldn't help but wonder what the future held. She was still a prisoner, still bound by chains she couldn't see, but perhaps, with time, those chains could loosen. Perhaps she could find a way to live, to survive, and maybe even to heal. And as she walked beside Luke, the man who had taken her in, Xenia allowed herself to believe, if only for a moment, that there was a future for her on this strange new world. A future where she could find her place, where she could reclaim her life, and where she could, perhaps, find peace. The days that followed Xenia's first walk with Luke passed in a strange, dreamlike haze. The world around her was so different from anything she had ever known, yet the routines that she and Luke slowly established brought a semblance of normalcy to her fractured life. Each morning she would rise with the dawn, the light filtering through her window painting the room in soft, muted tones. Luke was always awake before her, usually in the kitchen preparing breakfast or tending to the small garden that surrounded his home. Xenia found herself drawn to the garden, a space filled with Earth's native plants, their scents and colors both foreign and fascinating. The garden became a sanctuary of sorts, a place where she could lose herself in the simple act of tending to the plants, feeling the soil between her fingers, and listening to the rustle of leaves in the wind. It was a small thing, but it brought her a measure of peace. Luke noticed her interest in the garden and encouraged it. He began teaching her about the different plants, their uses, and the care they required. Xenia absorbed the knowledge eagerly, grateful for the distraction it provided from the gnawing emptiness that still lingered in her heart. She discovered a sense of purpose in the garden, a way to connect with this new world that was now her home, whether she liked it or not. One day, as they worked side by side in the garden, Luke spoke up, breaking the comfortable silence that had settled between them. You have a natural talent for this. You know, he said, his voice warm with admiration. These plants have never looked healthier. Xenia looked up from the herbs she was tending, her silver eyes meeting his. There was a hint of a smile on her lips, a rare sight since her arrival. We have gardens on Arendor too, she replied softly. The plants there are different, of course, but the principles are the same. Life thrives when it is nurtured. Luke nodded, a thoughtful expression crossing his face. I'd love to hear more about Arendor, he said after a moment. About your home, your people, If you're willing to share, that is. Xania hesitated, her hands stilling in the soil. Talking about Arendor was painful, a reminder of everything she had lost, but there was also a deep, aching need to remember, to keep her memories alive. She glanced at Luke, his green eyes watching her with a quiet patience, and something in her softened. He had been kind to her, gentle in a way she had not expected, and perhaps sharing her world with him would help ease the burden she carried. "All right," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'll tell you." They sat together in the shade of a large tree at the edge of the garden, the afternoon sun filtering through the leaves in dappled patterns on the ground. Xania began to speak, her words halting at first, but gradually gaining confidence as she described the wonders of her home planet. Arendor was a place of great beauty, she began, her gaze distant as she recalled the vibrant landscapes of her world. The skies there are never the same color twice. They shift with the time of day and the seasons, from deep indigos to bright purples and soft pinks. And the moons. There are two of them, Lyria and Xandor. They move in tandem, casting a glow over the land that's like nothing you've ever seen. Luke listened intently, his eyes never leaving her face as she spoke. There was a reverence in his expression, a deep respect for the world she described, even though he could never truly experience it himself. "The cities on Arendor are built into the landscape," Xania continued, her voice growing stronger. "We believe in harmony with nature, so our architecture reflects that. Our homes are part of the earth, made from living materials that grow and change with the seasons. It's like living in a living forest, where every tree, every plant is connected." Luke's eyes widened slightly, his imagination trying to picture the world she was describing. "It sounds incredible," he said softly, "like a paradise." Xania smiled faintly, though there was a sadness behind it. It is. But it's more than just the beauty of the land. It's the people, the sense of community, of belonging. We have a deep connection to each other, to our history, our traditions. Everything we do is guided by our respect for life, for the balance of all things. As she spoke, Xania found herself becoming more animated, the memories of her home flooding back with a clarity that both comforted and pained her. She told Luke about the festivals, the dances, the songs that filled the air during times of celebration. She spoke of her family, of her father's wisdom, and her sister's laughter, of the warmth and love that had always surrounded her. Luke listened in silence, absorbing every word, every detail. He could see how much Arendor meant to her, how deeply she grieved for what she had lost. But he also saw something else of strength, resilience that shone through even in her darkest moments. "Your world sounds like a dream," he said quietly when she finally fell silent. "I can see why you miss it so much." Xania looked down at her hands, which were now clenched in her lap. "It was more than just a place," she murmured. It was my life, my identity. Everything I was, everything I believed in was tied to Arendor. And now." She trailed off, her voice breaking. The weight of her loss suddenly felt unbearable, the reality of her situation pressing down on her like a physical force. Tears welled up in her eyes, and despite her efforts to hold them back, they began to fall, silent and steady. Luke reached out, his hand gently covering hers. "Xania," he said softly, his voice filled with compassion. "I can't pretend to understand exactly what you're going through, but I want you to know that you don't have to carry this burden alone. I'm here, and I'm not going anywhere." His words, simple yet sincere, broke through the wall of isolation she had built around herself. For the first time since her arrival on Earth, Xania felt a crack in the armor she had so carefully constructed. She had been so focused on her pain, her anger, that she hadn't allowed herself to truly see the person in front of her, someone who cared, who wanted to help her heal. Without thinking, Xania leaned into Luke, resting her head against his shoulder. The contact was tentative at first, but when he didn't pull away, she allowed herself to relax, finding comfort in the warmth of his presence. Luke's arm wrapped around her, holding her close as she cried quietly against him. They stayed like that for a long time, neither of them speaking, just being there for each other in the stillness of the afternoon. Xania's tears eventually slowed, and she found herself feeling lighter, as though a small part of the weight she had been carrying had been lifted. When she finally pulled away, Luke looked at her with a gentle smile. "Thank you for sharing that with me," he said softly. "I know it wasn't easy." Xania nodded, wiping the last of the tears from her eyes. Thank you for listening, she replied. It helped. Luke's smile widened, and for the first time, Zinnia felt a glimmer of something she hadn't experienced in a long time: hope. It was faint, fragile, but it was there, a tiny spark in the darkness that had consumed her. The days on Earth had begun to blend together, forming a new rhythm in Zinnia's life, one that, to her surprise, she was slowly beginning to accept. The bitterness and despair that had consumed her after her exile from Arendor had dulled, replaced by a cautious curiosity about this strange new world and the man who had taken her in. Luke's kindness had chipped away at her defenses, and though she still struggled with her situation, there was no denying that she had started to feel something she never expected to feel here: a sense of belonging. Xenia spent her days exploring the small world Luke had built for himself. She tended the garden with a dedication that bordered on devotion, finding solace in the simple, repetitive tasks of nurturing life. She spent hours in the small library Luke had curated, poring over books that opened her mind to new ideas and perspectives. And in the evenings, she and Luke would sit together, sharing stories, ideas, and sometimes simply enjoying each other's company in comfortable silence. As the days turned into weeks, Xenia began to notice something else: a shift in her feelings toward Luke. At first, she tried to ignore it, dismissing the warmth she felt in his presence as nothing more than gratitude for his kindness. But as time went on, that warmth grew, becoming something deeper, something that frightened her as much as it intrigued her. It was during one of their evening conversations that Xenia first acknowledged the change within herself. They were sitting on the porch, the night air cool and refreshing after the heat of the day. The sky above was clear, the stars twinkling brightly in a way that reminded her of the skies of Arendor. Luke was beside her, a cup of tea cradled in his hands as he looked out at the stars, a contemplative expression on his face. "Do you ever think about the future?" Xenia asked suddenly, breaking the silence between them. Luke turned to her, his green eyes thoughtful. "I do," he replied, "but I try not to dwell on it too much. The future is so uncertain, and I've learned that it's better to focus on the present, to appreciate what I have now." Xenia nodded, understanding the wisdom in his words, but she couldn't help the pang of sadness that accompanied them. "I used to think about the future all the time," she admitted. "Back on Arendor, everything was so certain. I knew my place, my path. I had plans, dreams." She trailed off, her gaze dropping to her hands, which were clenched tightly in her lap. The memories of her old life were still painful, a reminder of everything she had lost. But more than that, they were a reminder of how different her life was now, how uncertain her future had become. Luke reached out, placing a hand over hers, his touch warm and reassuring. "It's okay to mourn what you've lost," he said gently. "But it's also okay to dream again, to hope for a future, even if it's different from what you once imagined." His words struck a chord in her, and she looked up at him, her silver eyes searching his face for any sign of insincerity. But all she saw was the same kindness, the same compassion that had been there from the beginning. And something else, something that made her heart beat a little faster. "Do you really believe that?" she asked quietly. "Do you really think I can have a future here, after everything that's happened?" Luke's expression softened, and he squeezed her hand gently. "I do," he said, his voice firm with conviction. "And I'll do whatever I can to help you build that future. You're not alone, Xenia, not anymore." Xenia felt a rush of emotion at his words, a warmth spreading through her chest that was both comforting and terrifying. She had spent so long trying to keep her distance, to protect herself from the pain of her situation, but Luke's words, his kindness, were breaking down those walls, leaving her vulnerable in a way she hadn't been in a long time. And with that vulnerability came a realization that she was no longer just grateful to Luke, no longer just intrigued by him. She cared for him deeply, in a way that went beyond friendship, beyond the bond they had formed over the past weeks. It was love. The realization hit her like a shockwave, her breath catching in her throat as she tried to process the enormity of it. She loved him. The thought was both exhilarating and terrifying, a whirlwind of emotions that left her feeling unsteady, unsure of what to do next. How could this be? How could she, an Arendorian exiled from her home, fall in love with a human? The very idea seemed impossible, yet here she was, her heart racing in her chest, her thoughts a tangled mess of confusion and longing. She had never expected to feel this way, never expected to find something as powerful as love in the midst of her pain. But it was there, undeniable and overwhelming, and she didn't know what to do with it. Xenia Luke's voice brought her back to the present, his expression concerned as he watched her. Are you okay? She forced a smile, trying to calm the storm of emotions inside her. I'm fine, she said, though her voice was shaky. I was just thinking. Luke didn't press her, but she could see the worry in his eyes, the way he searched her face for any sign of what was troubling her. If you ever want to talk about it, I'm here, he said softly. You don't have to go through this alone. His words, so simple yet so full of meaning, made her heart ache with the intensity of her feelings. She wanted to tell him, wanted to confess everything that was swirling inside her, but she was too afraid of what it might mean, of what it might change between them. So instead, she nodded, her smile faltering as she tried to push the emotions down to keep them from overwhelming her. Thank you, Luke, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. They sat in silence for a while longer, the air between them thick with unspoken words. Xenia's mind was racing, her thoughts a jumble of conflicting emotions. She knew she couldn't ignore what she was feeling, couldn't keep pretending that everything was the same as it had been before. But the fear of what might happen, of what she might lose, kept her from speaking. As the night grew darker and the stars above twinkled like distant jewels, Xenia finally stood, her legs feeling unsteady beneath her. I think I'll go to bed, she said, her voice strained with the effort of keeping her emotions in check. Luke looked up at her, his expression still concerned, but he didn't stop her. Good night, Xenia, he said softly. I'll see you in the morning. She nodded, forcing another smile before turning and heading inside. But as soon as she was alone in her room, the emotions she had been holding back came crashing down on her, overwhelming her with their intensity. She sank onto the bed, her hands trembling as she tried to make sense of everything she was feeling. It wasn't just the love she felt for Luke that frightened her, it was the vulnerability that came with it. She had been so careful, so guarded, ever since her exile, and now all of that was crumbling away, leaving her exposed in a way she hadn't been in a long time. She cared for him deeply, and that care had grown into something more, something that scared her more than anything else. What if he didn't feel the same? What if she was misreading his kindness, his compassion? What if she confessed her feelings and it destroyed the bond they had built? But the thought of keeping her feelings to herself, of continuing to hide behind her walls, was just as unbearable. She couldn't go on like this, pretending that everything was the same when her heart was screaming for something more. And so after a long night of tossing and turning, Xenia made a decision. She would tell him. She would confess her feelings, no matter the risk, no matter the outcome. She had to, for her own sanity, for the sake of the bond they had formed. She couldn't keep hiding, couldn't keep pretending that she didn't care. The next morning, Xenia woke early, her mind still buzzing with the decision she had made. Her stomach was a knot of nerves, but she was determined. She couldn't keep running from her feelings, couldn't keep hiding from the truth. She found Luke in the kitchen, as she had every morning since her arrival. He was making breakfast, his movements calm and methodical as he worked. He looked up when she entered, a smile touching his lips. Good morning, he said warmly. Did you sleep well? Xenia forced a smile, though her heart was racing. Not really, she admitted, her voice shaky. Luke, I need to talk to you. His expression shifted, concern flickering in his eyes as he turned to face her fully. Of course, he said, his voice gentle. What's on your mind? Xenia took a deep breath, her hands trembling as she tried to find the right words. I've been thinking a lot about everything that's happened, about us, and... She trailed off, her courage faltering as she met his gaze. His green eyes were so full of kindness, so full of understanding, and it made her heart ache with the weight of what she was about to say. Xenia, Luke said softly, stepping closer to her. Whatever it is, you can tell me. You don't have to be afraid. His words, so gentle, so full of reassurance, gave her the strength she needed. She took another deep breath, her eyes locking onto his as she spoke the words that had been burning inside her for so long. Luke, I care about you, she said, her voice trembling with emotion. More than I ever expected, more than I ever thought possible. And I think I'm in love with you. The words hung in the air between them, heavy with the weight of their meaning. Xenia's heart was pounding in her chest, her hands shaking as she waited for his response, for anything that would tell her what he was feeling. For a moment, Luke said nothing, his expression unreadable, as he looked at her. The silence stretched on, each second feeling like an eternity, and Zinnia's fear began to creep back in, the doubts gnawing at her resolve. But then Luke stepped forward, closing the distance between them in a single, fluid motion. His hand cupped her cheek, his touch warm and gentle, as he tilted her face up to meet his gaze. His eyes were filled with emotion, a depth of feeling that took her breath away. "Xania," he said softly, his voice thick with emotion. "I care about you too, more than I can put into words. I've been trying to fight it, trying to tell myself that it's impossible, that it's wrong, but..." He trailed off, his thumb brushing lightly against her cheek. "But I can't deny it anymore. I love you, Zinnia. I've loved you for a long time." The relief that washed over her was overwhelming, a wave of emotion that left her feeling dizzy and lightheaded. She had been so afraid, so sure that her feelings would ruin everything. But here he was, confessing the same thing, feeling the same way. Tears welled up in her eyes, and she let out a shaky breath, a laugh bubbling up from her chest, as the tension that had been building for so long finally broke. "I was so scared," she admitted, her voice choked with emotion. I thought you wouldn't feel the same." Luke smiled, his own eyes misty with unshed tears. "I've been scared too," he said, his voice thick. "But now that it's out there, now that we both know, I don't want to hide it anymore." He leaned in, his forehead resting against hers, and Zinnia felt a rush of warmth, a sense of rightness that she hadn't felt in so long. It was like coming home, like finding the one thing she had been missing all along. "Neither do I," she whispered, her heart soaring as she closed her eyes, savoring the closeness, the connection between them. For a moment they just stood there, wrapped in each other's presence, letting the emotions wash over them. It was as if the world had faded away, leaving just the two of them, finally free to be honest, to be themselves. And then, without another word, Luke leaned down and kissed her. The kiss was gentle at first, tentative, as if both of them were afraid of breaking the moment. But as their lips met, a spark ignited between them, a fire that had been smoldering for weeks finally bursting into flame. Zinnia melted into the kiss, her hands reaching up to tangle in Luke's hair as she pulled him closer. The warmth of his body, the softness of his lips, the way he held her as if she was the most precious thing in the world, it was everything she had ever wanted, everything she had been afraid to hope for. When they finally pulled apart, both of them were breathless, their hearts pounding in sync. Luke rested his forehead against hers again, his eyes closed as he caught his breath. "I love you, Zinnia," he whispered, his voice filled with a depth of emotion that made her heart swell with joy. "I love you too," she replied, her voice soft but steady. "I've never felt this way before, about anyone." Luke smiled, his eyes opening to meet hers, and in that moment Xania knew that everything had changed. The walls she had built around herself had crumbled, and in their place was something new, something stronger, a bond between them that went beyond anything she had ever imagined. They spent the rest of the day together, the weight of their unspoken feelings finally lifted. There was a lightness between them now, a sense of joy that neither of them could contain. They talked and laughed, sharing stories and dreams, their connection deepening with each passing moment. As the sun set and the stars began to twinkle in the night sky, they found themselves back on the porch, sitting together as they had so many times before. But this time there was no tension, no fear, just the warmth of each other's presence, the knowledge that they had found something rare and beautiful. Xenia leaned against Luke, his arm wrapped around her shoulders, and sighed contentedly. "I never thought I could feel this way again," she admitted, her voice soft in the quiet of the night. "Not after everything that happened." Luke pressed a kiss to the top of her head, his lips lingering against her hair. "Neither did I," he said quietly. "But here we are, and I wouldn't trade this for anything." They sat in silence for a while, the stars above them a silent witness to their newfound love. Xenia felt a peace she hadn't known in so long, a sense of belonging that had eluded her ever since her exile. She had found something here on Earth, something she hadn't expected, and it was more precious than anything she could have imagined. As the night wore on and the air grew cooler, Luke stood, pulling Xenia up with him. "Come on," he said, his voice gentle. "Let's go inside, it's getting late." Xenia nodded, but before they could move, she turned to face him, her heart swelling with emotion. "Luke," she said, her voice trembling with the intensity of her feelings. "Thank you. For everything. For being there for me, for loving me." Luke cupped her face in his hands, his touch warm and comforting. I should be the one thanking you, he said softly. You've brought something into my life that I never thought I'd find. I'm so grateful for you, Zinnia. I love you. Tears filled her eyes again, but this time they were tears of happiness, of gratitude for the love she had found in the most unexpected place. I love you too, she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. They kissed again, a slow, lingering kiss that spoke of all the feelings they had held back for so long. It was a kiss that sealed their bond, that marked the beginning of something new, something beautiful. As they pulled away, Zinnia smiled, her heart light and free for the first time in what felt like an eternity. Let's go inside, she said softly, her hand slipping into his. Luke nodded, a smile on his face as he led her inside, the warmth of their love surrounding them like a protective cocoon. And as they walked together into the house, into their future, Zinnia knew that she had finally found what she had been searching for all along: home. Not the home she had lost, but a new one, a place where she was loved, where she belonged. It was a future she had never expected, but one that she was ready to embrace with all her heart. And in that moment, Zinnia knew that no matter what challenges lay ahead, no matter what obstacles they might face, she and Luke would face them together, hand in hand, heart to heart, because they had found something stronger than fear, stronger than doubt. They had found love, and that, Zinnia knew, was all she needed. The first light of dawn spilled gently over the horizon, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold. The early morning mist clung to the ground, swirling lazily around the small house that Zinnia now called home. Inside, the quiet stillness was interrupted only by the soft sounds of life, Luke's steady breathing beside her, the gentle rustle of leaves against the window, and the faint hum of life waking in the world outside. Zinnia lay in bed, her hand resting lightly on the small, rounded curve of her belly. A new life was growing there, a symbol of the love she and Luke had discovered together, a love that had blossomed in the most unlikely of circumstances. As she felt the baby move within her, a soft fluttering that brought a smile to her lips, Zinnia was filled with a deep sense of contentment, of peace. It had been several months since the day she and Luke had confessed their love for each other, and in that time, their bond had only grown stronger. The initial fear and uncertainty that had once clouded their relationship had given way to something solid and enduring, built on trust, understanding, and the deep affection they shared. They had faced challenges, of course. Their relationship was far from conventional, and the world around them had not always been kind. But together they had navigated those challenges, finding strength in each other and in the love they had built. Zinnia's pregnancy had been a surprise, but a welcome one. It had brought a new dimension to their lives, a new hope for the future. The knowledge that they were bringing a child into the world, a child that would be a unique blend of both their cultures, had filled them with a sense of purpose and joy. They had spent countless hours talking about the future, about the kind of life they wanted to build for their child, about the legacy they wanted to leave behind. Luke stirred beside her, his arms slipping around her waist as he pulled her closer. Zinnia turned to him, her heart swelling with love as she met his sleepy gaze. His hair was tousled from sleep, and his green eyes were soft with affection as he looked at her. "Good morning," he murmured, his voice husky with sleep. "Good morning," Zinnia replied, leaning in to press a gentle kiss to his lips. Luke's hand moved to rest on her belly, a tender smile spreading across his face as he felt the life growing inside her. "How are you feeling?" he asked, his voice filled with concern and love. "I'm good," Zinnia said softly. "The baby's been active this morning." Luke's smile widened, a look of wonder crossing his face. "I still can't believe it," sometimes he admitted, his voice thick with emotion, "that we're going to be parents." Zinnia's heart swelled at his words, and she reached up to cup his face in her hand, her thumb brushing lightly across his cheek. "Neither can I," she said, "but I'm so happy, Luke, so happy that we're doing this together." Luke leaned into her touch, his eyes closing for a moment as he savored the warmth of her hand. "I love you, Zinnia," he whispered, his voice filled with sincerity and devotion. "I love you too," she replied, her voice equally filled with emotion. They stayed like that for a moment, wrapped in each other's presence, their hearts beating in sync. The world outside seemed to fade away, leaving just the two of them, connected in a way that transcended everything else. Eventually they both rose, the morning routine calling them to the day ahead. Luke headed to the kitchen to prepare breakfast, while Zinnia took a moment to herself, standing by the window and looking out at the garden they had tended together. The garden had become a symbol of their life together, a place where they had nurtured not just plants, but their relationship, their dreams, and now their growing family. The plants were thriving, their vibrant colors a testament to the care and attention Zinnia had lavished on them. She smiled as she watched a bird flit among the flowers, its song filling the morning air with a sense of joy and renewal. As she stood there, a memory came to her, unbidden but welcome. She thought of her father, of his wise eyes and gentle voice, and of the lessons he had taught her as a child. He had always spoken of the importance of balance, of finding harmony in all things, and those lessons had stayed with her, even through the darkest of times. Now, as she prepared to bring a new life into the world, she felt a deep connection to those teachings, a sense of responsibility to pass them on to her child. The thought of her father brought a pang of sadness, a reminder of the family she had left behind on Arendor. She wondered what they would think of the life she had built here, of the choices she had made. Would they understand? Would they accept the path she had chosen, the love she had found? But even as the questions lingered, Zinnia felt a sense of peace. She knew, deep in her heart, that she had made the right choices, that she had found her place, her purpose. And she believed that, wherever they were, her family would be proud of her, would understand that she had followed her heart, and that she had found happiness. As if sensing her thoughts, Luke appeared behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist and resting his chin on her shoulder. "Penny for your thoughts," he asked, his voice soft. Zinnia leaned back into him, a smile tugging at her lips. "Just thinking about the future," she said, her hand resting on his as it lay on her belly. "Yeah," Luke's voice was filled with curiosity. "What about it?" Zinnia turned in his arms, looking up at him with a smile that was both tender and determined. "About the kind of life we're going to build for our child," she said. "About the kind of world we want them to grow up in." Luke's expression softened, and he nodded, understanding the weight of her words. "We'll make it a good one," he promised. "A world where they can be proud of who they are, where they can embrace both of their cultures, both of their heritages." Zinnia's heart swelled at his words, and she nodded, feeling a deep sense of gratitude for the man she had fallen in love with, the man who would be the father of her child. "I know we will," she said softly, "and I can't wait to see it." They stood like that for a moment longer, holding each other, before Luke finally pulled back, a playful grin on his face. "Come on, breakfast is ready," he said, taking her hand and leading her toward the kitchen. The smell of freshly cooked food filled the air, and Zinnia's stomach rumbled in anticipation. Pregnancy had heightened her senses, and she found herself craving all sorts of new and interesting flavors. Luke had taken to experimenting in the kitchen, trying to satisfy her cravings with a variety of dishes, some familiar, some entirely new. As they sat down to eat, Zinnia couldn't help but feel a deep sense of contentment. The small house, the garden, the meals they shared together was all so different from the life she had once known on Arendor, yet it was exactly what she needed, what she wanted. After breakfast, they went for a walk, a routine they had established early in her pregnancy. The fresh air and gentle exercise were good for her, and it gave them a chance to talk, to dream, to plan for the future. The path they walked wound through the woods behind their home, a place that had become special to them both. As they walked, Luke took her hand, his grip firm and reassuring. "I've been thinking," he began, his tone contemplative, "about what we want for the future, for our child." Zinnia looked up at him, her curiosity piqued. "What have you been thinking?" Luke paused for a moment, choosing his words carefully. "I want to make sure that they know both sides of their heritage," he said, "that they understand where they come from, both from Earth and from Arendor. I want them to feel connected to both worlds, to be proud of who they are." Zinnia nodded, her heart swelling with affection for him. "I feel the same way," she said softly. "I want them to know the stories of Arendor, to understand our traditions, our beliefs, but I also want them to know about Earth, to feel connected to this world too." Luke smiled, his eyes filled with warmth. "Then we'll make sure they have that," he said. "We'll teach them everything we can about both worlds, and we'll make sure they know how much they're loved." Zinnia's eyes filled with tears, but they were tears of happiness, of gratitude for the life they were building together. "Thank you, Luke," she said, her voice thick with emotion, "for everything." Luke stopped walking, turning to face her, his hands gently cupping her face. "You don't have to thank me," he said softly. "We're in this together, Zinnia, always." She smiled through her tears, her heart full to bursting with love for this man, for the life they were creating together.
Over 600 meter.
Always she whispered, leaning in to kiss him. The kiss was soft, gentle, filled with all the love and affection they felt for each other. It was a promise, a vow to face whatever the future held together, hand in hand. When they finally pulled apart, they continued their walk, their hands still entwined, their steps in sync. The world around them was quiet, peaceful, the only sounds the rustle of leaves and the distant call of birds. It was a moment of serenity, of connection, and Zinnia savored it, feeling a deep sense of gratitude for the life she had found, for the love that had blossomed in the most unexpected of places. As they walked, they talked about the future, about the dreams they had for their child, about the kind of parents they wanted to be. They spoke of the lessons they would teach, the values they would instill, the love they would give. It was a conversation filled with hope, with optimism, and Zinnia felt a renewed sense of purpose, of excitement for what was to come. When they returned home, the day stretched out before them, filled with possibility. Zinnia spent some time in the garden, tending to the plants that had become so dear to her. Luke joined her, working alongside her, their movements in harmony as they nurtured the life around them. As the sun began to set, casting a warm glow over the garden, Zinnia looked up at the sky, her thoughts turning to the future once more. She knew there would be challenges ahead, that the road would not always be easy. But she also knew that they would face those challenges together, that they had built something strong, something lasting. That evening, as they sat together by the fireplace, Zinnia felt a deep sense of peace, of contentment. She rested her head on Luke's shoulder, his arm wrapped around her, and sighed happily. "I can't wait to meet our baby," she said softly, her hand resting on her belly. "Neither can I," Luke replied, his voice filled with warmth. "They're going to be amazing, just like their mother." Zinnia smiled, her heart swelling with love for the man beside her, for the life they had created together. And their father, she added, her voice filled with affection. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, the fire crackling softly in the hearth. The warmth of the flames, the coziness of the room, the presence of the man she loved, it was all so perfect, so right. As the evening wore on, Zinnia found herself growing sleepy, her eyes drifting closed as the firelight flickered against the walls. Luke noticed, his hand gently brushing a strand of hair away from her face. "Let's go to bed," he said softly, his voice filled with love and tenderness. Zinnia nodded, too tired to protest, and allowed him to help her up. As they made their way to the bedroom, hand in hand, she felt a deep sense of contentment, of fulfillment. She had found her place, her purpose, her love, and she knew that whatever the future held, she was ready to face it with Luke by her side. As they lay in bed, Luke wrapped his arms around her, holding her close. "I love you, Zinnia," he whispered, his voice filled with sincerity. "I love you too," Luke, she replied, her voice soft with exhaustion and happiness. And as she drifted off to sleep, her thoughts filled with dreams of the future, Zinnia knew that she had found everything she had ever wanted. A home, a family, a love that would last a lifetime. It was more than she had ever expected, more than she had ever hoped for, and she was grateful for every moment, every memory, every step that had brought her to this place. Because in the end, it wasn't just about where she had come from or where she was going. It was about the journey, about the love that had blossomed along the way, about the life she had built with Luke, and the future they would create together. And as the night deepened, and the world around them quieted, Zinnia knew that she was exactly where she was meant to be.
linksaf te slaan en op de A50 te blijven. Blijf 17 kilometer doorrijden op de A50. N279 richting Veghel, Helmond. Over 800 meter neem afslag Veghel naar N279 richting Veghel, Helmond. Neem afslag 11 Veghel. Over 500 meter volg de twee linkerrijstroken om de verbindingsweg N279 naar Veghel, Helmond te nemen. Volg de twee linkerrijstroken om de verbindingsweg N279 te nemen en volg een rijstrook naar keuze om linksaf te slaan naar de Rijksweg. Volg een rijstrook naar keuze om linksaf te slaan naar de Rijksweg, de N279. Blijf 12 kilometer doorrijden op de N279. Over 600 meter ga bij de rotonde rechtdoor naar de Broekdalerbaan, de N279. Over 600 meter sla linksaf naar de waterleliesingel. Sla linksaf naar de waterleliesingel. Rij 1,5 kilometer op de N279. Over 600 meter sla linksaf naar de Boendersberglaan. Sla linksaf naar de Boendersberglaan. Over 300 meter sla linksaf naar het Horstlanderpark. Sla linksaf naar het Horstlanderpark en sla rechtsaf om op het Horstlanderpark te blijven. Sla rechtsaf om op het Horstlanderpark te blijven en sla linksaf om op het Horstlanderpark te blijven. Sla linksaf om op het Horstlanderpark te blijven. Over 400 meter sla linksaf naar de Dierdonklaan. Sla linksaf naar de Dierdonklaan. Over 300 meter sla rechtsaf naar de Braaksestraat. Sla rechtsaf naar de Braaksestraat en sla linksaf om op de Braaksestraat te blijven. Braaksestraat te blijven en sla linksaf om op de Braaksestraat te blijven. Sla linksaf om op de Braaksestraat te blijven en je bestemming bevindt zich aan de linkerkant.